Welcome to another X Space hosted by Democrats for an informed approach to gender. Lisa Simeone is out. I'm Ellie, DIAG's founder, and I'm here with Michelle, one of our team members and a Substack contributor. We're very excited to host this DIAG Space. DIAG is a 501c3 organization dedicated to shedding light on the harms of gender ideology, the medical scandal of so-called gender-affirming care, and the erosion of women's rights. To learn more about our mission, please go to our website, diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Anyone pushing back against gender identity ideology and the gender-affirming care model faces the frustration of not getting the evidence of harm heard and acted upon. While most of us are not whistleblowers, aspects of our experiences mirror those of the whistleblowers portrayed in The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation, and the Price of Saying No, a tough read by our guest today, author Carl Elliott. Dr. Elliott, who trains as a medical doctor, is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of 8 books. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, the Carrie and Ann McGuire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Library of Congress, a resident fellowship at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio, and a visiting associate professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In addition to his articles in academic journals, he's also written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, the New York Review of Books, The American Scholar, and the New York Times. The Occasional Human Sacrifice chronicles the stories of those who raised the alarm when medical researchers blew past ethical guardrails and harmed patients. Welcome, Dr. Elliott.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
First, give us a little background on yourself. You went to medical school, but then turned to philosophy and bioethics rather than practicing medicine. How did you come to this field?
Well, by upbringing more than anything else, I guess. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, Clover, South Carolina. My dad was a doctor. My mom was a librarian. And went off to Davidson College thinking that I was going to become a doctor. And I was pre-med there, went to medical school in Charleston, South Carolina. But kind of got disillusioned with the whole business right at the start. I mean, I just didn't take for me medical school. Um, I should say I'm hearing an echo of everything that I'm saying.
Okay, I'm not hearing an echo. Are you on headphones that are, not plug-in headphones?
I'm not on headphones.
You're not on headphones. Okay.
No.
If people in the audience, can you raise your hand if you're hearing an echo? Because I'm not getting an echo. Anybody getting an echo? No, it's not.
Only me. All right.
Yeah, I'm a
I'll
little
try
concerned that it's because you're not on the phone. The phone makes it a little bit. It's a little more friendly, but
yeah.
yes.
I can remember my brother was a couple of years behind me in medical school, and I can remember when he graduated, he said something to the effect of, "I wonder how long it'll take me to become a human being again." And I think what he was getting at, and also, what I experienced was there's something about the experience of medical training that really uh, sort of makes you jaded and calloused and kind of cynical and bitter and entitled also. And I just didn't like the kind of person that I was becoming. And I mean, medical training is like getting on a train that doesn't really have any stops until it reaches the end point, which is completing residency training. And there wasn't an easy place to get off of the train. I decided that I was going to try to, after I finished medical school, to do a PhD in philosophy. I'd done some philosophy as an undergraduate, and so I went to graduate school in Scotland to do philosophy, mainly as a way of escaping medicine and seeing if there was another career path that would suit me. And found that I wasn't too bad at it. When I finished, it seemed as if excuse me, the fact that I had a medical degree meant that people um, thought I would be good at doing bioethics. And so I sort of got sucked into the world of bioethics, of medical ethics, and working in that sort of um, field of bioethics in the humanities. Uh, Not really by choice so much as just sort of being drafted into it. And that's kind of where I've been for most of my career.
I think sort of, I don't think a lot of people have a good handle on what a bioethicist does. So maybe you could just give us a brief description of that so we're all on the same page.
Well, it's not entirely easy to explain. There are a variety of bioethicists. There are people more or less like my job now who are basically just college university professors who teach bioethics and write about bioethics as their specialty within the field of philosophy or religious studies or law or some other usually humanities or social science discipline. There are clinical ethicists. These are people who work in academic health centers and hospitals to provide advice to clinicians about ethical problems. And there is also something which is more relevant to what I was writing about in the book, a research ethics committee, a research oversight committee known as institutional review boards, which sometimes have bioethicists on them, but not necessarily. And these are the ethics boards that oversee the conduct of medical research within an institution.
Got it. Okay, that gives us some our bearings.
Hi, Carl. So you didn't just write about whistleblowers, you're a whistleblower yourself. Can you just tell us a little bit about the case that caused you to speak out against your own employer, University of Minnesota, a little bit about how that all unfolded?
Yeah. So this was you can Google his name. Anybody can Google his name, Dan Markinson. So I had been here at the University of Minnesota for a little over 10 years or so. This was in 2008 when I read in the newspaper. I was in the academic health center at that point. I was in the Center for Bioethics as a faculty member. And I read a series in the St. Paul Pioneer Press about a young man named Dan Markinson who had committed suicide in a psychiatric research study here at the U. It was a grisly story and it was horrific. Basically, he had been psychotic, incompetent to consent, and dangerous, threatening to kill people when he was recruited into a drug um, study of atypical antipsychotic drugs by the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca that was taking place in our department of psychiatry. Now, he was not in any position to give consent to this study. He was floridly psychotic. He was on a locked unit. He was under a civil commitment order to uh, that instructed him to obey the treatment recommendations of the psychiatrist who was recruiting him into the study. And his only family member, his mother, did not want him in the study and tried as hard as she could to keep him out of it. But he was signed up anyway because he gave consent, not valid consent, but consent. And things went downhill very quickly. He was discharged to a halfway house. He started to spiral downward. He got more psychotic. He got agitated. Um, his mom said it was like he was so tense he was about to explode. During this period, she is trying everything that she can think of to get him out of the study. She is calling the study coordinator. She is texting. She is sending emails. She's writing to the chair. She's turning up to the department, telling them again and again, I'm worried. Eventually leaves a voice message for the study coordinator saying, does he have to kill somebody or kill someone else before anyone will do anything? And then 3 weeks later, he tried to decapitate himself with a box cutter. And his body was found in the shower of the halfway house, along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. Now, I was horrified um, by this story that I just read. I had not heard about it. I was kind of shocked that I hadn't heard about it because it had taken place 3 years earlier, and I knew nothing about it. I was in a very good position to hear something about it. It's the issues that I work on. I work on psychiatric ethics. I work on research ethics. I was friends with people in the Department of Psychiatry. I was for a number of years, or at least several years, on the IRB here, and yet a young man had almost decapitated himself in a research study in our department, and I knew nothing about it. And so I started asking around. Nobody seemed terribly upset about this. Nobody really seemed interested in learning more. Um, I eventually decided that I needed to meet the mother, uh, who was not entirely, eager to meet anybody who was associated with the University of Minnesota, but she agreed to, and I talked to her. And she was totally reasonable. I mean, she said, "Look, you don't have to believe what I'm telling you or what you read in the newspaper. Just look at the records for yourself. I'll give you access to everything." And so, medical records, diaries, court depositions, external reports, everything I got access to, and it looked as if everything that she had been saying was correct. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was even worse than it had been portrayed in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. After about a year of trying to push for some sort of accountability, or at least a sort of unbiased investigation um, of this case internally, I decided the only way I could get any attention to it would be to write about it for a magazine. And I'd done a fair bit of writing for magazines like the New York and the Atlantic. And I wrote about this for Mother Jones. And as it happened, the sponsor of the study at the time was under scrutiny and defending itself in litigation for um, fraudulent marketing. And it turned out that a lot of the misrepresented studies that it was using to market um, the drug, Seroquel, were leading back to the University of Minnesota as well. And so I wrote about it, put the two stories together, story of the fraud, the story of the suicide, and hoped that um, some sort of scrutiny at a national publication would shame the university into taking some kind of action, or at least there would be some sort of public outrage about this that would pressure the university to get an external investigation. And that didn't happen at all, not even close. So then the question is, what do you do next? Because the Mother Jones article accomplished nothing. And so, along with my colleague in the bioethics center, Lee Turner, and later with a whistleblower uh, nurse and safety specialist in the hospital, Nikki Jerry, we started trying to agitate for some sort of external investigation, basically trying everything that we could think of, protests, petitions, letters, complaints to the FDA, to the Office of Human Research Protection, to the Attorney General of Minnesota's office, um, letters to alumni, letters to donors, uh, anything that you can imagine to put pressure on the university. I think that we tried, again, with zero success in any way. All this was over a period of years. And it was only with the help of a former governor, Arnie Carlson, who miraculously decided to get involved in this case after meeting with me, that we eventually, this was largely Arnie's doing, got an investigation by a state watchdog agency called the Office of the Legislative Auditor, which did a very thorough report. It was a vindication. It basically found a cover up by the university and conflicts of interest and undue pressure on Dan Markinson uh, to enroll in the trial, and all of the things that essentially we had been um, making the case for all of these years. And so, for a brief moment, it felt like we'd finally gotten what we had been working for. But again, it turns out that vindication is not really the same thing as fixing the problem. And now that was in March of 2015, and so we're 11 years out. And I would say that really nothing changed at the university as a result of that. There was no formal apology. There was no compensation for the mother. There were no sanctions for the investigators. Um, there was no reform, no real reform at the university, and so um, it looks like you know what about a 7 or 8 year long failure would be the.
And didn't the university seek damages from the mother actually?
Uh,
Sure.
they did. So this is part of what got me so angry about the case is that she had initially taken the university to court and filed a civil suit against them, which was dismissed by a Minnesota court on grounds that the university had statutory immunity from this kind of lawsuit. So, no matter what the merits of the case, the university could not be sued. And the university took the opportunity. I mean, obviously, she could have appealed that. And to prevent her from appealing it, they turned around and filed a notice to assess costs against her for, I believe, $56,000, which obviously, I mean, she is not a woman of means. And so she couldn't pay it. And they came to a settlement where they said, we will drop the demand for $56,000, which they claimed they were owed for court costs for hiring expert witnesses and so on to defend itself in court, that they would drop that claim if she would drop her any claim that she had to appeal the judgment. And this seemed like such a terrible, indefensible, shameful sort of hardball tactic to deploy against a woman whose son had died of suicide in a research study here that I just, yeah, I, I felt ashamed to work at the University of Minnesota, to be honest.
Yeah, in your book really chronicles not only your own experiences, which could be a book in and of itself, but um, one sort of shocking ethical violation after another in all these different places. The Tuskegee experiment, in which African American men were denied syphilis treatment so researchers could track the course of the disease. There was the scandal at Willowbrook State School, where mentally disabled children were held in extreme conditions of extreme neglect, really abysmal, horrific conditions, exposed to hepatitis A and B, and all the other cases of of abusive research that you documented. Do you see, or what do you see as the common threads in these cases? What conditions or patterns do you kind of see repeated? Is it researchers don't see these people as human? What do you see as sort of the common threads in these cases that come up over and over?
Well, I should say that the book came out of a class that I started teaching much earlier, mainly as a way to try to make sense of what I had been through, a class on research scandals. And so my thought with the class was, um, let me, let us, as a seminar, let us look at a lot. Usually, I think we usually cover about 25, 27 scandals over the course of the term. A lot of these scandals side by side and see what sort of patterns emerge as a way of understanding, how research goes bad. And one of the things that I found very quickly was that whistleblowers are rare. I just assumed that many, if not most, of the cases came to light publicly because someone on the inside blew the whistle, or that there was some sort of external oversight body action being taken. Um, and that turned out not to be the case. It turns out in the vast majority of cases, there are doctors, there are nurses, there are administrators, there are study coordinators, study personnel who know what's going on, who know that research subjects are being lied to or mistreated or exploited or even killed, and they don't say anything, um, often for a very long time, sometimes even for decades, but very often for years. So that's one sort of striking pattern that I saw. Um, the other thing is that the abuses are very often on populations that are vulnerable in some way. They are, well, like with Tuskegee, it was poor black sharecroppers in Alabama. With Willowbrook, it was institutionalized, um, mentally disabled, developmentally disabled children. Um, Very often, it is a population of people who are vulnerable because of their circumstances. They're mentally disabled, they're mentally ill, they are in an institution of some sort, they are desperate because they have a disease that's very likely to kill them. Um, and these are the easiest people to take advantage of if your motives not are not the best. Another striking thing that this was probably I don't know why. I'm not really shocked by anything anymore. At least I think I'm not. But I do remember thinking that this seemed shocking. Is one of the things that I wanted to look at was what happens to um, the investigators, the researchers in these studies, because some of these studies are so famous that they're taught to medical students as a sort of cautionary tale of how medical science can go wrong. Um, but they're always taught in a certain way. Um, and the certain way is to concentrate on the abuses, the actions, the situation that led to the abuses. And there are very often no characters in the story. Whistleblowers are characters in the story, but they're never mentioned. Another thing that's never mentioned is what happened to the investigators responsible for these abuses after the study has been uncovered. And the striking thing to me was that not only were they not punished or sanctioned or sort of slink away in shame, very often they were rewarded. They're given prizes and honors and deanships and honorary degrees and have um, prizes and lectureships named for them. Yeah, I could probably think of some more patterns, but those are the ones that those are the striking things that come to mind. Oh, I should also say the whistleblowers do very poorly. They do not come out of these stories well.
Can you say a little bit more about that, sort of the trajectory for most whistleblowers?
I mean, there's certain things that you will find in any uh, sort of ethnography or study of whistleblowers in all kinds of settings, by which I mean corporate settings or government settings, not just medical settings of the type that I was looking for. And that is that they are uh, ostracized, they're very often punished, they're often fired. Sometimes they are uh, threatened with arrest or prison. Um, they are attacked and sort of discredited by the institution that they're going after. Um, they often find themselves unemployable afterwards because really, who wants to hire someone like this who is sort of famous for calling out their colleagues for wrongdoing? Um, all of that was not surprising to me because that's the pattern that you see in the vast majority of whistleblowing situations. I guess what I didn't anticipate was how damaged, how sort of psychologically wounded so many of the whistleblowers that I talked to were, even in the cases where it seemed on the outside as if they had won. It seems as if vindication or um, you know accomplishing something positive, like having a study shut down, for example, um, very often, even despite that, they feel as if they've lost, and they carry that. They carry those wounds with them for the rest of their life. I mean, it was striking to me that some of the people, you know, um, three of the cases that I looked at in the book were exposed in 1972, and another one exposed in the 1980s. And very often, actually, yeah, and another one took place in the 80s, was exposed in 2001. Um, Now, many of the whistleblowers were quite young when they spoke out, and so I was talking to them decades later, when they were in their 70s or 80s, and very often, even half a century later, they would tell me, you know, not a day goes by that I don't think about this case. Um, it is just striking how deep and lasting those wounds are.
Yeah, there was a line in the book. You talk about a book by Fred Alford. He's author of Whistleblowers, Broken Lives, and Organizational Power. And he made this striking statement. It was that that a large number of whistleblowers actually were, considered suicide.
Yeah, no, there's data on that. A lot considered suicide. Um, a lot have other sort of mental health issues. Uh, One whistleblower that I talked to, and this was someone who you know blew the whistle decades earlier. Uh, had been had serious substance abuse problems. He was smoking crack, you know, in his 80s. He had PTSD. He had, had a long history of mental health issues as a consequence, and that doesn't seem uncommon at all. A lot of them. This was. hmm, I shouldn't say. A lot of whistleblowers find themselves estranged from their families and their friends. A lot are dealing with financial issues as a result of losing their job. Uh, it's just a lot to deal with.
So, I'm going to bring it back a bit. These, you know, people are witnessing these scandals from within, and I, I would think that they'd be relying on this kind of community of bioethicists or this position or the IRBs to be um, the people who are going to step up and stop this. They're the ones, but they're not for some reason. What's going on there? Aren't those people in those positions the ones who are saying, let's stop what's happening?
Well, it's different for bioethicists and for IRBs, and so it is the job of the IRB, which sometimes will have a bioethicist on them, but it is the job of the IRB to protect the rights and welfare of research subjects. That's why they were set up. And so the IRB in an institution is the first line of defense. It's the first, it is the primary oversight body for protecting subjects. When something goes wrong, that is where complaints generally go. But what I found in that, in the class on research scandals that I taught, is that I think almost every study, every abuse that we looked at had been approved by an IRB or something equivalent. I mean, IRBs didn't exist in their current form in the 1950s and 60s, and so very often there was a faculty committee or some sort of departmental oversight. But almost all of them have some kind of oversight, and you would think that those would be the bodies that, when it becomes clear that research subjects are being harmed or exploited, they would step in and take action and protect them. But very often, I would say in most cases, they don't. And it's not entirely clear to me why. Um, the best explanation I have is that since they approved the study at the beginning, that they feel in some ways implicated in it, and it's difficult for um, it's difficult for anybody, including any committee, to admit that they've gotten things wrong. There are also some handicaps that are built into the nature of institutional review boards, and the handicaps are um, first that they only approve studies on paper and largely in advance, right? So an IRB will get a protocol telling them, here's what we plan to do. Here are the risks. Here are the benefits. Here's the drug. Here's the procedure. Here's the consent form. All the kind of things that go into setting up a research study, and they will approve it. But after that, or turn it down, right? But after that, they are not there on the wards or in the lab or wherever the study is taking place, watching to make sure that everything is going okay. That part is an honor system. And so the way the system is set up, um, it depends on people who see bad things happening, who see subjects being lied to or deceived or dying and the death not being reported or anything fraud, anything that can happen in a study. um, it's their job to tell the IRB. They are like the internal whistleblower, and that just seems to rarely happen. Um, so, I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that we have this sort of multi-billion-dollar global medical research industry with funding by contract research organizations and pharmaceutical companies and device companies and all this sort of money at stake, not to mention the reputations of academic researchers. And the main line of protection is the honor system. But that's what we have. An honor system is kind of easy to game if you're not honorable.
Well, yeah, it's a little shocking. It's hard to figure out why, because so much is at stake. That the price that, well, maybe that's the point, that you'd think the price that they would pay for this kind level of medical abuse um, would be in and of itself enough of a threat, but
Well,
clearly.
there was, I mean, if you go back and look at the history, um, there were in the early 70s, you had this series of shocking abuses: the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook hepatitis study. There were studies taking place in prisons, Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania, for example, and the Cincinnati radiation studies. And there was a movement, a political movement, um, led mainly by Ted Kennedy, um, to regulate medical research, like to institute a full blown regulatory system like we have for other potentially dangerous industries. And there was such pushback by the medical research establishment against the idea of being regulated that was dropped. And instead, we got this sort of peer review honor system, which was a big improvement on what was there before, which was essentially nothing. But it was really a far cry from what some of the real reformers wanted.
So,
Well, oh,
sorry, I'm jump in. You do have one case that ended with a measure of justice, and that's the one in New Zealand. So, can you tell us about that? Why did things kind of go okay in that situation?
New Zealand is a very progressive, enlightened country, and so and it's also very small. So a lot of things. There are a lot of things in New Zealand that I think many of us in the rest of the world look at and wonder why couldn't we do that? And this is one of them. So the big sort of spectacular. I should say that I used to live in New Zealand. I was a postdoc there, and then have gone back at the University of Otago in New Zealand, in Dunedin, and go back there quite a lot. Um, so the scandal there, which is easily it is to New Zealand what the Tuskegee syphilis study is to the United States, was a study that took place beginning in the 1960s, ending in the 80s, at National Women's Hospital in Auckland. And it was a case where women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated for years and sometimes decades. And many of them went on to develop cervical cancer and die. And there were three gynecologists working at National Women's Hospital. The one that I got to know quite well was Ron Jones, but two others who had died by the time I moved to New Zealand in 1990 were Bill McIndoe and Jock McLean. And the three of them pushed internally to have that study stopped for years, doing everything that they could think of, except the one thing that could have possibly gotten it shut down, which was to go to the press. But they were very, very traditional, sort of patrician doctor types, and uh, going to the press was not something that ever even really occurred to them. Um, Eventually, they did publish a study in a medical journal, which they thought would be the kind of explosion that would generate public outrage about the study and have it shut down. But it didn't, or at least not until two journalists, Sandra Coney and Phillida Bunkle, heard about it and started investigating, and eventually wrote an article for Metro magazine, which at the time was a big sort of national um, general interest magazine in New Zealand, and that was the explosion that really just rocked the medical establishment, and um, and not just the medical establishment, the public at large. And unlike these scandals here in the United States, there was immediate action. One, they appointed a judicial inquiry. A senior judge, uh, a woman, um, to oversee uh, an investigation into it. Um, they had public hearings for months in which they allowed all the victims to testify publicly if they wanted to. They came up with a report at the end and recommendations for reforms. They called the investigators to account and forced them to explain themselves publicly. They were sanctioned for their wrongdoing, and the women were compensated. And at the end of it, they reformed their research oversight system totally and have not had a major scandal in, yeah, well, since that emerged in 1988. And so I think in almost every way that other whistleblowers hope, um, that was a success. I mean, there were apologies, there were punishments, there were reforms. Um, and the reforms were successful. So you would think that Ron Jones, the whistleblower, would feel pretty good about that, but he doesn't. He's he died last year actually, but when I was speaking to them over the years that I spent with him, he was tormented by it. He was tormented by guilt, by anger that uh, that there were still people who thought that he shouldn't have done what he did. Still people in New Zealand who sided with the villains of the studies, and he honestly, till the time he died, I don't think he ever really got over it.
So, in this case, what was the I mean, what do you think the defining environmental factor was, you know, Jones not being happy with it aside for a second? I mean, what systems were in place that allowed New Zealand to shift and for things to actually truly change?
Well, one thing is the openness of the system there. I mean, there is this tradition that New Zealand inherited from the UK of having open judicial or government inquiries into things like this. And in New Zealand, they really make an effort to make it transparent. And so it was, it was like, in a way, like the Senate Watergate hearings here in 1973. It was on television, it was reported, it was open. Anybody could go and sit in, and there was no secrecy about it. That never happens in the United States. You'll sometimes have these in Canada, but in the States, um, we settle things by litigation, and litigation is very often ends with some sort of confidentiality agreement. And so, even if there is some sort of lesson to be learned or justice that's served, um, nobody learns about it because it's all kind of hidden away. So that's one big difference. Um, Another thing, and this is not unique to New Zealand, but this is something that I noticed about some of the cases that I looked at. One of the questions I think for anybody blowing the whistle, or for that matter, for any investigative journalist, is why is it that when some scandals are made public, because this is the sort of desperate maneuver of whistleblowers, they very often tried to have things fixed internally, and as a kind of last resort, they go to a reporter with the hope that um, if the world knows what they know, then the authorities will take action in some way. And only rarely does that happen. And so, one question, like very often, a scandal is reported, and there may be a day or so of outrage, but then it just sort of goes away. And the question is what makes some scandals go away and some catch fire? And one of the things that I noticed about the scandals that I wrote about that caught fire, or at least some degree of fire, was that they dovetailed with a larger social movement or a larger political movement. So um, Tuskegee dovetailed with the civil rights movement in obvious ways, right? It was poor black men in Alabama, and this was 1972. So it was easy for people to believe that this had happened, and it was easy to place it in this larger um, political movement. In New Zealand, the what they called the unfortunate experiment, the cervical cancer scandal at National Women's, dovetailed with the women's movement. in the 1980s, which was really gathering steam then. And to the extent that Willowbrook could be considered a success, maybe yes, maybe no, but to the extent that it could, um, it dovetailed with the disability rights movement. And so it's those kinds of cases that seem much more likely to catch the public attention and to attract some sort of constituency with a stake in the issues involved.
So now let's go back to Jones and his sense of kind of demoralization over this. Um, you didn't hear things kind of went well, but you still have somebody who sees it through a different lens. So, what distinguishes the person who is willing to speak up? Wh- What is the psychology of whistleblowers? What characterizes this group that makes them both willing to risk their careers and their social standing while others have doubts but remain silent, and then also the sense of normally you'd think that you'd be so proud, you'd be a hero, you'd feel like you had done something, but not with whistleblowers.
Um, there have been a lot of people over the years who have tried to pinpoint some sort of whistleblower personality, some sort of character trait or set of traits that could predict who would blow the whistle and who wouldn't. And those have generally been very unconvincing. So I honestly don't think that there is a whistleblower personality type. What I do think is that there are situations that make people more or less likely to blow the whistle. I mean, there may be a cluster of personality types, but uh, it's very difficult to sort of characterize them. I will say, I could say a few things. One, uh, whistleblowers tend to have some measure of idealism in the sense that they genuinely believe that if the world could just see the abuses that they are seeing, that something would be done, right? That the authorities are going to leap into action, that people of good conscience are going to be on board, that their friends are going to stand by them, that their colleagues are going to be on their side rather than the institution. Um, you have to have something like that before you speak out. If you're a total cynic, then your view would be, why would I do this? I'm just going to immolate myself, and it'll accomplish nothing. I think the disappointment for most whistleblowers is that that idealism isn't fulfilled. They think the authorities are going to leap into action, and then the authorities don't do anything. And they think that all of their colleagues are going to side with them, but the colleagues side with the institution. And it never even occurs to them that their friends might abandon them. And yet, very often, that's what happens. And so they come out of it with this tremendous sense of um, disillusionment and a kind of often a sort of existential despair because you know the way the world is has been exposed to them in a way that they didn't anticipate. Um, they thought the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and they find out that it doesn't. And that can be a very hard thing to try to come to terms with. You have to sort of rebuild your life in a way. You have to be able to come up with some sort of story to tell yourself in which you're not a chump, you know, because when you've spent all this time and effort trying to accomplish something and then fail, um, it's hard not to feel as if um, to avoid the feeling that you were just terribly naive. Um, One thing, you're asking about characteristics. Now, one thing that I did find, and I would not want to generalize this because um, this is a very small and uh, not unbiased sample size that we're talking about here. But I was struck by how tenacious and stubborn many of the whistleblowers that I talked to were. By which I mean, um, they just kind of refused to give up, often, for years or even decades. I mean, um, yeah, somebody like John Pasando out in Seattle, uh, you know, close to 20 years he worked on this. Martha Stevens in Cincinnati, she wasn't working on it constantly, but again, about 20 years of her life. Peter Buxton took him 7 years of effort to expose Tuskegee. I mean, that is a lot of time and a lot of determination that I think a lot of people just don't have. Now, the reason I say that I'm not entirely sure that that would be characteristic of whistleblowers um, is that the whistleblowers that I looked at are the ones who at least had a measure of success, um, at least had enough success that the scandals that they were trying to blow the whistle on um, became well known enough for me to know about them, right? So a small measure of success. Um, there could be many, many other whistleblowers who tried, but were just crushed or had no success in the beginning and gave up much earlier. Maybe they didn't have the tenacity to stick it out, um, but that doesn't really say anything about their willingness to speak up, right?
Right.
It just, I guess I would say that achieving some measure of success in whistleblowing often takes a tremendous amount of tenacity rather than whistleblowers are tenacious.
A- And I think, so, there's this sense of, we've talked about this sense of honor that, this is the right thing to do. And then there's the tenacity, are these just, yeah, tenacious people in general, kind of pit bull types, or is it that this sense of justice and the need for justice, is it that that's so strong that they become tenacious?
Um, I think the dynamic works out differently in different situations. I mean, some people are genuinely shocked um, when they speak up internally, thinking that everybody in the department or in the center or in the medical school is going to see things the way that they do, and then they are abruptly fired or um, or punished in some way. I think there are some who develop. I mean, look, I mean, what very often happens to a whistleblower in any kind of institution um, is that the institution itself strikes back very hard and very fast and with a lot of force and intimidation. One of the I used a quote from John Passando at the as an epigraph for the book, which what he told me was every whistleblower is an amateur playing against professionals, and that is true in the sense that whistleblowers generally don't know what they're doing. They don't consider themselves whistleblowers. They're just trying to. They've seen something that looks bad to them. They're trying to get it stopped, and uh, the whole situation sort of snowballs. And before they know it, they are locked in mortal combat with their institution, and it tends to make them very often incredibly angry and incredibly suspicious of the institution because the institution defends itself. The first line of defense is you have to discredit the whistleblower, and they find themselves the subject of whisper campaigns, PR leaks to to journalists, very often threats internally. There's one whistleblower that I talked to. I don't profile her at length, but you can look her up, Nancy Oliveri in Canada. She found herself on the wrong end of a poison pen campaign within the hospital where people were getting anonymous letters about her, lies, um, uh, rumors, innuendo, all trying to discredit her and portray her as crazy or dishonest. Um, all of these things tend to make even, the most generous spirited, mild mannered person very angry and very uh, often kind of hardened uh, against their institution and suspicious and um, almost it becomes almost impossible for them to believe that anyone in the institution in a position of authority is trustworthy in any way. Um, and that tends to drive the tenacity. I think there becomes this sense that um, to give in would be to admit defeat, and admitting defeat would mean sort of um, giving up everything that you have staked your entire sense of honor and conscience and integrity on for a period of years. And that's just a very hard thing for a lot of people to do.
So, a kind of a two-part question related to the flip side of that. So, we're sort of talking about the psychology of whistleblowers. There's also the psychology of doctors and researchers. There's the psychology of how institutions function. So, these cases that you write up involve medical doctors inflicting pretty gruesome harm in the name of science. They leave diseases untreated. They leave cancer patients, to die horrible deaths. The bone marrow transplants where 84 out of 85 patients died. The physician in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute, the same institute that awards the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine, killing patients with artificial tracheas that he, as far as I could tell, he knew they didn't work. So the first part of the question is, do you think there's a recurring psychological profile of these doctors? What motivates them? And then I'll ask the second part after you answer that.
It's hard to say. I mean, again, I hesitate to generalize. There there are some physicians who researchers who fall in love with our own ideas, and it becomes impossible for them to believe that they are wrong or give up on the idea, and they just keep trying and trying, even when the prudent course would be to stop. Um, there's some who commit abuses because of financial incentives or financial pressures within the institution. There can be a lot of money at stake with some studies. I mean, the case at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, Paolo Macchiarini, I think genuinely he had a lot of characteristics that you see in sociopaths and psychopaths. You know, pathological lying, sort of charismatic charm, um, a kind of absence of remorse, an inability to sort of foresee the terrible consequences of his actions. Um, in a way, I think he's kind of an outlier. Although I should say that I did write about another doctor psychopath who ended up in prison in New Zealand. Not a researcher, but so I wouldn't say that I wouldn't I wouldn't want to claim that there are a lot of sociopathic researchers, but I would say that there are some. Um, I think the striking thing is how institutions let these people get away with it, even when it becomes clear that patients are being harmed. Um, you know, you look at there's a fantastic film by a friend of mine, a Bossa linguist, um, about the scandal at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. It's called in Swedish it's called The Experiments. In English it's called Fatal Experiments. It was shown on the BBC in the UK, and it is astonishing to see, even after there is such hard evidence that these trachea transplants are not working, that people are dying, that Macchiarini is falsifying his research results, when all of this is presented by the whistleblowers and then presented even in even more um, graphic visual detail by Bossa Linguist. It's amazing to see all of these members of the Nobel Prize Committee and senior officials at the Karolinska Institute line up behind Macchiarini instead of the four respected senior um, physicians who were blowing the whistle. Why? Like, how does that happen? I honestly don't have a generalizable explanation. What I will say
And that
is that when I ask that same question of the whistleblowers, very often they had explanations of how it happened in their institution.
and were there common threads in their explanations? I mean, I'm kind of curious about just the general atmosphere in academic medicine. Is it sort of an institutional structure that makes it less likely that people will take a stand or will tend to like circle the wagons around and protect their own? But you're also saying, these very respected researchers and doctors were dissenting and still were, pushed out and vilified.
Yeah. Well, one, I mean, as you can imagine, um, the doctor whistleblowers that I talked to were very often very cynical and critical of academic medicine and academic medical training and medical school training. They had a lot of critical things to say. Um, what a lot of them will say, and I would echo, is that academic medical institutions tend to be extremely authoritarian and extremely hierarchical. I mean, if you can imagine an equivalent of like a military unit. It is equivalent. I would say it's in the same ballpark in the sense that the entire training process is a matter of sort of knowing your place in the hierarchy, and then as you get better and better, you ascend to a higher place, and you have people below you. And so that tends to that sort of hierarchical authoritarian structure, I think, works against whistleblowing or anybody who is a dissenter or a nonconformist to the group. So that's you know that's one sort of structural barrier to whistleblowers. Another one that I think distinguishes academic medicine from other sorts of institutions that would also have a hierarchical structure is that academic medicine considers itself a its self-conception is all about a moral humanitarian mission, right? Um, it is built around the idea, which has a lot of justification, that coming up with new treatments for illnesses and disabilities is a positive thing, and that academic medical institutions do good in the world, right? Again, I think that is true and that is defensible. I think the problem is that that sense of a moral mission can also cloud or it can cloud the the vision of dissent in a group, and it can also sort of contribute to the punishment of dissenters, because if you see someone who's exposing some wrongdoing in your institution, and and you see the exposure of that wrongdoing as something that is going to impair the public reputation of the institution, you can justify squashing it by saying that it's working toward the greater good. That look, yeah, we understand that sometimes research subjects die, and sometimes there are bad things that happen, but there are bad things that happen in any institution, and we need the public to trust that we need the public to believe in what we're doing. Otherwise, we're not going to have funding. We're not going to have research subjects. We're not going to have the gratitude of the public. We're not going to have the sort of elevated status that, in large part, depends on this idea of humanitarianism that academic medicine is given.
So, you're saying, that these people should, the system should be that these people are trusted, that people who are in good standing, but that rarely really doesn't happen. So all the mechanisms that should be in place to either stop these kinds of studies or to stop them from happening in the first place, those are somewhat, in some situations, those are broken. And the allegiance to the organization and the environment um, precludes people opening up their mouths, and why we have a lot of people who know that there's something wrong but don't speak up. So, in the case of your investigation, it took the intercession of um, secession of a former governor of Minnesota. You mentioned him, Arnie Carlson, who you crossed paths with, and it took him to get the public to pay attention to the abuse. So, is this the lesson that you need a prominent, respected outside political figure to come forward? Uh, in this case, it seemed like Carlson was his involvement was the tipping point. Is that do you, do things need an outsider tipping point? because the whistleblowers themselves, the organization kind of works against them?
I would hate to say that's what that's what you need, because uh, that would be really dark. I mean, if everybody depends on some sort of benevolent, person with power and good conscience to save the day, then we would be in a really bad situation. Plus, Arnie is just an extraordinary figure. I mean, you know, honestly, there are very few Arnie Carlsons out there. I think one of the difficulties in the way that our research oversight system is set up that makes this so hard is that even if you want to blow the whistle, it's not really clear who you blow the whistle to. Um, this is one thing that New Zealand, when they reformed their oversight system, understood. So here in this country, I mean, this will probably be incredibly boring, but I should just explain it briefly. But so, as I was saying earlier, the Institutional Review Board is sort of the first line. That's the main protective body. But very often, the Institutional Review Board is itself unresponsive to complaints from the outside, for all kinds of reasons. Institutional capture is probably one of them, because everybody answers to, everybody in the academic health center answers to the dean of medicine and the administration of the university. But then the question is, well, if they're not responsive, who do you go to? And there is really no good answer to that. I mean, I thought, when I was sort of trying to figure this out for myself, the obvious place would be the Office of Human Research Protection, which is a federally funded office that is an office of research protection. It's right there in the name, and which is supposed to be where complaints about abuses can go. But then it turns out I knew that it was not a large office. It's a very small office, and even smaller now during the Trump administration. But it turns out that the uh, the Office of Human Research Protection will only look into potential abuses if they're in federally funded studies. So studies funded by the National Institutes of Health or the Department of Energy, or another uh, federal department. And that means only a tiny percentage, because the vast majority of studies now are funded by the pharmaceutical or device industries. So you can't go there. Uh, the next place you might think you could go would be to the FDA. And you can file a complaint to the FDA. But good luck finding out anything about whether they're doing anything or not, because they treat that as confidential information. And it also turns out, I mean, the FDA is not in the research protection business, it's in the drug safety business. And so their investigations, even though they sometimes do them, are secret and um, and often not very good. And so you really have no recourse other than that, except for just trying to figure out like who has some sort of political power that might be able to do something about this. Um, you know, go to politicians, go to the legislature, go to the medical licensing board, go to, anywhere that you can think of, the attorney general's office, and try to persuade somebody to take action. But the problem is very often, um, those offices will say, this is not really our business, our problem. And so uh, that is a kind of structural issue with abuses to medical research that needs to be fixed.
So you're kind of saying it's a combination of strategy and chance that these tipping points happen in these cases where finally you encounter the right person, and then the whole thing starts to crumble. Maybe it takes decades, maybe it takes a couple years. I mean, do you see each of these cases as sort of having their own tipping point where finally things shifted?
I mean, in some cases, they didn't ever shift. This is the issue. Um, I mean, I can just give you a few examples. I mean, I would say that the unfortunate experiment in New Zealand is one where things really did shift, and to some extent, Tuskegee. Although I would say um, the results of that are not anywhere close to what they could be or should have been. Um, but so, for example, with the Macchiarini scandal at the Karolinska Institute, I mean, that went on for years until Bossa Lindquist's three-part documentary series on Swedish television. And it was so powerful and so riveting and so damning that when it was shown, um, everything, I mean, public outrage was such that the government had to do something. And so heads started to roll and people started to lose their jobs. Um, and criminal charges were filed against Macchiarini. Uh, if you talk to the whistleblowers, though, they'll say, uh, you know, in the end, it really didn't accomplish all that much because all the people who were fired got very soft landings and now they have very good jobs because the charges against Macchiarini were dropped. And then, it took years. They were finally brought back, but then the most serious were dropped, and he wound up being convicted, but being able to serve out his sentence in Spain, possibly under house arrest rather than actually going to prison. With the abuses at Willowbrook, of which the hepatitis study was only one, there were lawsuits and state actions, and eventually Willowbrook was shut down. But it took over a decade for that to happen, and it was replaced by a series of residential shelter-like um, housing for the people who were there that has turned out to be a pretty dismal situation for them. So, you know, in all of these cases, they the narrative takes a different sort of arc and for different reasons. And I'm not entirely sure that you could even identify a tipping point for most of them.
I did watch some of the interviews with the whistleblowers from the Karolinska um, Institute. They looked shaken to the core by what they had faced. And I guess I'm curious, for you, a whistleblower as well, as you look back, are there things that you know, you would have done differently that you wish you hadn't done? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I I feel as if my friend Lee Turner and who was there the whole time and did most of these things with me. It wasn't just me alone. Um, I feel like we wasted a huge amount of energy on things that if I if I knew then what I know now, I could have predicted that they would fail. Um, I mean, one thing that Lee spent a tremendous amount of time doing was putting together these extraordinarily detailed, kind of massive reports of evidence of wrongdoing. Um, not just on the Markinson case. I mean, the Markinson case is the one that got all the attention, but there were other scandals within the psychiatry department, some of which we uncovered as a result of our digging and finding, um, filing freedom of information requests, and some of which were uncovered by journalists who were sort of very dogged, uh, um, digging into these things. But I think his assumption was, look, if I put together this massive dossier of convincing evidence with just the facts and send it to people in a position of power, that if they were to read it, then they would come to the conclusion that we were right and they would do something. And that turned out to really accomplish nothing. We spent a huge amount of time collecting signatures for public petitions. Um, we gathered letters. We gathered a letter signed by health lawyers, bioethicists, kind of senior figures in medical research to put together to send. God, we put together several of them. One went to the faculty senate here at the University of Minnesota. Um, that, you know, that was a lot of wasted effort. We thought that we could put pressure on the university by going to large donors and alumni and explaining to them what had happened and how they could help by putting pressure on the administration. That accomplished nothing. I had the vague idea that if I just talked about this um, constantly in academic talks, grand rounds at other institutions, um, writing about it, writing op-eds, uh, that would accomplish something. I think that accomplished very little. We had a lot of actions on campus, um, informational events, protests, people carrying signs, a vigil in front of the building where the Board of Regents was meeting. A group of student activists wearing white coats carried a black coffin into a Board of Regents meeting. Um, there's some satisfaction in that, but I don't think we changed any regents' minds by doing that. Um, all of these things seem, in retrospect, kind of acts of desperation. Like, I have no idea what else to do, right? We seem to have tried everything that we could think of. We've gone to every office, spent time trying to get the medical licensing board to act, to get the Office of Human Research Protection to act. And in the end, none of it made really any noticeable difference at all, until Arnie Carlson got involved.
Yeah, I have to say it's it was hard to read the book, and it is kind of demoralizing to hear this because I think a lot of us in our realm are doing all those things. Some of the exact same things, and facing the futility of a system that doesn't seem to care about the evidence or doesn't care about the harm. Um, there's a disconnect there, and so we're looking for our Arnie Carlson moment to a certain extent. Um, when you think about the medical scandal we're dealing with, um, we have an administration that moves against the gender clinicians, but then it only seems to make the party really dig in its heels. So, it's kind of like that response, right? That the clinics the research projects that you were dealing with and your other whistleblowers were dealing with had, where you make a move to right the ship, and their response is to dig in and attack you. Um, but here we have this kind of, it's on such a bigger scale and it's in the realm of politics. Have you any have you seen anything like this in the history of medicine and whistleblowers that you covered, where it became such a big political issue in addition to the research setting?
I was trying to think of something that might um, be a parallel, and I can't really think of any good ones. Um, there are definitely politicized issues in medicine. Um, I mean, they're constant. The whole right to die movement, for example, became very political with right to life versus or sort of right to die versus sanctity of life, with the sort of predictable political divisions, abortion. Um, there are a lot of those, but I can't think of anyone um, that seems like a direct parallel that has become politically divisive in this particular way. What I can say, I mean, just to go back to my own experience here, and sort of what I learned. Um, what I can say is, I think what made the difference for me in getting Arnie Carlson on board was meeting with him face to face. We just met over breakfast and spent the entire morning together, and credited him for being willing to do that. Um, but I think the importance of that is that Arnie came to realize that I was not crazy, that I wasn't a crank, and that I was genuine and sincere about this, and convinced. And that is hard to do, simply by writing letters or emails, or even sort of making phone calls or contacting people on social media. There, a lot of which we did. You know, um, I mean, it's a credit. Like, I had no special in with Arnie. I had no special reason why because he was the one who suggested meeting up face to face. Why he did that with me. Um, he was just responding to the same generic letter or email that I'd sent to a gazillion other politicians and leaders of nonprofits and other people in positions of authority in the state. It was just that instead of throwing it away or saying no thanks, he said, let's have breakfast. But it turns out that breakfast was, I mean, that's what turned things around. I mean, honestly, it feels like just that morning is when, if there was a tipping point, then that, in retrospect, looks like that's what it was. I should also say that I have probably more experience on the other end the of the whistleblower. Like, I have more experience as someone who people want to blow the whistle to, by which I mean a lot of people. But it's because of the fact that I've worked on um, issues around psychiatry, which tends to have a lot of questionable practices, and medical research, and quite honestly, because I've been very critical of the pharmaceutical industry, that I have a lot of people who read the things that I've written, read my books or written articles that I've written for the New Yorker, the Atlantic, or now at Mother Jones, and have gotten in touch with me because they have a story to tell, and it's something that is outrageous, and they think I can help them with it. And I should say, I try, because of my own experience trying to do this, I try to talk to as many people as possible. And a lot of those people are just not credible, or they're not correct, or I disagree with them, or you know, it turns out that that the conversation that I have with them is not satisfactory to them, because I can't write about it for one reason or the other. I mean, it's worth remembering that not everybody who claims to be a whistleblower is actually a whistleblower. There are a lot of people who claim to be a whistleblower who actually have some kind of axe to grind, or who were in it for some kind of selfish reason. And any journalist knows this, and a lot of people in politics know this. And the only way to get their attention and to show them that you are credible is to have hard evidence, very often written documentation, and to be able to have a face-to-face conversation with them where you can show them that you are a serious person.
Yeah, I think in this, the hard thing in this particular situation is that they're not neutral people who just need evidence. This topic is so problematic and a threat. So getting the rejections of face-to-face meetings is the quotient's pretty high
Yeah,
because it's so toxic. Um, so
yeah.
that's a big change. All right, I want to go to questions since we're coming up on quarter two. Before I do that, I have to ask if there's any snowball's chance in hell that we'll see you focus on the issue of the uh, gender affirming care medical issue.
I don't have any plans to. I wouldn't rule it out, but it's not something uh, that I'm planning to do.
Okay. All right. Had to ask. All right. Let's take questions from the audience. Um, as usual, we expect you to be civil, and if you're having trouble getting elevated to speaker, or if it seems like we're not hearing you and you're not able to ask your question, please try logging out and back in, or post them, and then we'll do our best to get to them. No questions. I'm not surprised. Great. Bioethicist Carl Elliott is the author of The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation and the Price of Saying No. It is a riveting but a very troubling read. Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I
Absolutely.
appreciate the invitation.
You can all learn more about Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender at our website, diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Our power to challenge this ideological movement is in our numbers. Please join us. Good night, all.